Picture a missile the size of a telephone pole, roughly 5 feet long, about 160 pounds, spinning on its own axis as it flies. No radar dish, no dedicated fire control beam, guided by the infrared heat of whatever it is chasing. It costs roughly $1 million. It reaches targets only a few miles away. The US Navy has been firing versions of it since the Reagan administration. Now picture the SM-6, full 16 feet of advanced interceptor, Mach 3.5 capability, a price tag in the multiple millions per round, able to reach targets 100 miles out and knock down ballistic missiles on the edge of the atmosphere. The Navy fields both. They live on the same ships. And the question that should immediately follow is, why? Why would a fleet that spends hundreds of millions equipping a single Arleigh Burke class destroyer with the most sophisticated combat system ever put to sea still bolt a 21-round launcher of a compact 1980s missile to the back deck as the last thing standing between the ship and a sea? Skimming threat? That question is the whole story. And the answer is not what the price tags suggest. Here is where this goes. The longer reach, costlier outer layer exists to push the problem away. The short, fast, spinning inner layer exists because the outer layer can be overwhelmed. And when those two realities collide, when a swarm closes inside the outer envelope and a captain has seconds, not minutes, to decide which round goes where, the arithmetic of naval defense inverts completely. The cheap missile becomes the indispensable one. The expensive one becomes a question of how many you have left. Stay with this, because the layers matter, and each one changes the picture. The RIM-116 Rolling Airframe Missile, RAM, did not emerge from some post-Cold War defense review or a lessons learned study from the Gulf. Its roots run back to the 1970s, when US Navy planners were working through a specific nightmare: Soviet anti-ship cruise missiles arriving at low altitude fast in saturation numbers. The USS Stark incident in 1987, when an Iraqi exocet strike killed 37 American sailors aboard a frigate that never fired back, accelerated what was already in development. The Navy needed something that could handle the terminal phase, the last few miles, the last few seconds, when a threat had already penetrated every other layer and was still coming. What came out of the joint US-German development program was a weapon built around a specific set of constraints. It had to be small enough to mount on ships that already had full weapon loads. It had to react fast enough to engage threats that arrive with almost no warning. It needed no dedicated fire control radar of its own, because in the terminal seconds of an engagement, pointing a radar beam at a target, tracking it, assigning a round, and waiting for a solution takes time the ship may not have. The rolling airframe configuration, the spin that gives the missile its name, was the engineering answer to radarless guidance. A conventional missile stabilizes itself aerodynamically, which requires fin-sized and positioned for that purpose. A rolling airframe stabilizes by rotation, which frees up the body for a different guidance approach. Early RAM rounds homed on the radar emissions of the incoming threat itself, using passive homing against the weapon's own radar seeker. Later variants added infrared imaging. The missile hunts the heat signature of the target's exhaust. The combination means RAM can engage a threat without announcing its own presence on the electromagnetic spectrum. It does not ping, it follows. The first operational RAM launchers to sea in 1992. The system has been upgraded in blocks ever since. Block 1 added the dual-mode infrared seeker. Block 2 increased range and added an imaging infrared terminal seeker for more precise endgame targeting. But the physical package has stayed compact. 21 rounds in a launcher that weighs roughly 14,000 pounds fully loaded, about the footprint of a large pickup truck. On an Arleigh Burke class destroyer displacing nearly 10,000 tons, that launcher is a small corner of the ship. What it represents in the defensive architecture is not small at all. The threat environment that produced RAM has not simplified. It has multiplied. The sea-skimming anti-ship cruise missile that worried Cold War planners is now joined by subsonic drones flying in swarms, fast inshore attack craft loaded with explosives, supersonic anti-ship missiles like the Russian P-800 Onyx, and the Houthi-operated variant of the Iranian Shahed 136 family. A slow, cheap, one-way loitering munition that can be launched in dozens simultaneously from a coastal position. Each category presents a different problem. Each arrives in the terminal zone on a different timeline and a different signature profile. The one thing they share is that they all eventually get close, and close is where RAM lives. What's most surprising about the modern threat picture isn't that the Navy faces saturation scenarios. It's that the saturation threat is frequently delivered by the cheapest possible technology against the most expensive possible platforms. A US Navy carrier strike group represents somewhere between $10 and $15 billion of hardware and years of training. The weapons being thrown at it from Houthi-controlled territory include drones that cost less than the fuel in a single FCA-18 Super Hornets drop tanks. To understand why RAM matters structurally, you need to understand what it sits inside. Naval air defense is not a single system. It is concentric rings, each with a different job, different range, and different cost profile. The outermost ring is the FCA-18 Super Hornet, or the F-35C Flying Combat Air Patrol, fighter aircraft hunting threats before they reach launch range. Inside that is the SM-6 Interceptor, fired from the Mk-41 vertical launch system aboard an Arleigh Burke class destroyer, or a Ticonderoga class cruiser capable of engaging airborne threats at long range and high altitude. Then comes the standard missile SM-2, a shorter reach surface-to-air interceptor for mid-range threats. Inside all of that is the evolved Sea Sparrow missile, a short-range point defense missile. And at the innermost ring, before you get to the physical hull of the ship, are two final resort systems. The Phalanx CIWS, the 20mm Gatling gun that puts 6,000 rounds per minute into the sky, and RAM. Each ring handles what the previous ring did not. They are not redundant. They are sequential. A threat that penetrates the fighter cap enters SM-6 range. A threat that penetrates SM-6 range enters Sea Sparrow range. A threat that gets through Sea Sparrow encounters RAM. A threat that passes RAM encounters Phalanx. This architecture is called defense in depth, and its logic is not complicated. No single system is perfect, saturation is possible at every layer, and depth means that an attacker has to defeat multiple independent systems in sequence, rather than defeating one good system once. The reason this matters for understanding RAM is that the inner layers are not backup plans for a failed outer layer. They are the designed answer to outer layer saturation. The SM-6 is not expected to intercept everything. It is expected to intercept as much as possible at range, reducing the number of threats that reach the inner rings. When it cannot reduce that number to zero, and in a saturation scenario, RAM is not a fallback. RAM is the plan. Here is the first concrete constraint. An Arleigh Burke class destroyer carries 96 Mk-41 vertical launch cells. Those cells hold SM-6 interceptors, SM-2s, Tomahawk cruise missiles, and anti-submarine rockets. Not all 96 are loaded with SM-6. A typical loadout might carry a mix depending on the mission, but even a heavily air defense-weighted configuration allocates cells across multiple weapon types. Against a saturation swarm of, say, 30 or 40 incoming threats, even a generous SM-6 load is a finite resource. Shoot, shoot, look, shoot consumes cells fast. The doctrine of firing 2 rounds at a single target to ensure a kill doubles consumption. A sustained multi-wave attack drains long-range cells in ways that cannot be replenished at sea. The RAM launcher on the same destroyer holds 21 ready rounds. That is 21 engagements in the terminal band without touching the vertical launch inventory. On a Nimitz class or Gerald R. Ford class carrier, RAM launchers are positioned at multiple points around the flight deck perimeter, typically 2 or 3 launchers providing overlapping coverage. The carrier itself carries no vertical launch cells for air defense. It depends on its escorting destroyers and cruisers for area defense. Its own point defense is RAM and Phalanx. That is the entirety of last-ditch protection for an asset worth roughly $13 billion. What the outer layer buys is time and distance. What happens when that time runs out is determined by what is physically in the inner launcher. The economics of the exchange are uncomfortable to examine, and they are worth examining precisely because they are uncomfortable. An SM-6 interceptor costs approximately $4 million per round, depending on the variant and contract year. A RIM-116 RAM Block 2 round costs on the order of $900,000 to $1 million. A Shahed 136, the one-way attack drone used by the Houthis in strikes against commercial shipping in the Red Sea and against US naval assets, costs somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000 per unit, based on open-source assessments of Iranian manufacturing costs. The numbers do not sit comfortably side by side. The cost asymmetry is not accidental. It is the strategic logic of the adversary. When a Houthi battery launches a wave of Shahed drones at a US Navy destroyer, the exchange mathematics favor the attacker at every price point. A single SM-6 kill of a Shahed costs $4 million to neutralize a $20,000 weapon. RAM changes that ratio, but does not eliminate it. A $1 million RAM round intercepting a $20,000 drone is still a 50-to-1 cost disadvantage. Phalanx changes it further. 20mm ammunition is cheap, and the Gatling system is designed for exactly this kind of low-signature saturation threat. The point is not that RAM is cheap, it is that RAM is cheaper than the alternative at its ring. Using an SM-6 to handle threats that have already penetrated to the inner band is not just expensive. It is counterproductive because it consumes long-range capacity to handle a short-range problem, and long-range capacity is what stands between the ship and the next wave of threats before they become inner band problems. The Navy has been absorbing this math in real time in the Red Sea. Since Houthi forces began targeting commercial shipping and naval vessels in late 2023, USS Carney, USS Mason, and other destroyers operating in the region have fired SM-2 and SM-6 interceptors at incoming drones and anti-ship missiles at a rate that raised concerns about inventory depletion. Replacing SM-6 requires industrial production timelines measured in months. A destroyer cannot reload at sea. What it carries when it leaves port is what it has. That is the constraint that makes RAM's 21-round, quickly cycled inner capacity not a footnote in the system. It is the inventory protection mechanism for the expensive outer layer. There is a detail in the RAM system's design that does not make headlines but matters operationally. The Mk-49 RAM launcher is trainable. It can rotate and elevate to track a target independently of the ship's main fire control systems. In an engagement scenario where the ship's Aegis combat system is tracking and prioritizing multiple threats simultaneously, the RAM system can be operated in autonomous mode, using its own sensors to identify and engage targets without requiring the combat management system to allocate dedicated processing to it. This matters in saturation scenarios specifically because saturation is designed to overload decision-making capacity, not just interceptor inventory. A system that can engage without queuing for fire control bandwidth is worth more in those seconds than its price tag suggests. Here is the part that does not sit right even now. The same compact, spinning, self-guiding design that makes RAM effective in terminal engagements also means it reaches only a few miles. Against a supersonic anti-ship missile like the Russian Kh-35 or the Chinese YJ-12 derivative, the geometry is genuinely tight. A target approaching at high subsonic speed gives the terminal defense systems perhaps 30 seconds of engagement window at most before impact. RAM's reaction time, the interval from target detection to round away, is measured in seconds. The margin is real, but it is not generous. Which brings the whole architecture back to the question planted at the beginning, and it is worth restating it precisely. The Navy has outer layer interceptors that reach 100 miles and cost multiple millions. Why keep a short, spinning, 40-year-old design at the inner ring? The answer is not that RAM is better than SM-6. It is that better is the wrong frame. The outer and inner layers solve different problems on different timelines. What makes RAM irreplaceable at its ring is a combination of properties that the outer layer systems are not optimized for. Fast autonomous reaction in dense multi-threat scenarios, low cell count consumption, passive guidance that functions in electronic warfare environments where a radar-guided system would be disrupted, and a small physical footprint that puts 21 ready rounds on a hull without consuming a single one of the Mk-41 cells that the SM-6 needs. Put yourself in the Combat Information Center of an Arleigh Burke destroyer for a moment. The Aegis system is tracking 14 inbound contacts. 3 are confirmed Shahed 136 drones at low altitude, bearing 270, range 15 miles. 4 are possible anti-ship cruise missiles, bearing 265, range 40 miles, still in SM-6 range. The remaining 7 are unclassified contacts, low radar cross-section, altitude near sea level. The captain has been at sea for 62 days. The SM-6 load is down to 31 rounds from its original complement after the previous night's engagement. The question is not which system is better. The question is which round goes where, in which order, and how many of each you have left when the next wave launches. That decision, allocation under scarcity, under time pressure, with imperfect threat identification, is what the entire layered system is designed to support. SM-6 handles the 40-mile contacts, while RAM handles the 15-mile contacts. The systems work the same engagement simultaneously, using independent guidance mechanisms without competing for the same fire control resources. The depth is not decorative. It is the operational requirement. What this tells us about how naval defense actually functions is worth stating plainly. The dominant factor in a saturation engagement is not the performance ceiling of the best interceptor. It is the aggregate capacity across all layers, and the ability to allocate that capacity without exhausting any single layer before the engagement ends. RAM exists precisely because the outer layer, however sophisticated, is not inexhaustible. The inner layer's job is to ensure that exhausting the outer layer does not mean losing the ship. The Block 2 upgrade to RAM, formerly designated RIM-116C, introduced an imaging infrared seeker for the terminal engagement phase, replacing the earlier passive radar-infrared dual-mode guidance. The imaging IR system gives the missile a picture of the target in its final seconds, allowing it to aim for specific points on the airframe rather than tracking the centroid of an infrared signature. Against a drone or cruise missile with onboard countermeasures, this matters. A flare can spoof a simple infrared seeker. It has more difficulty spoofing a seeker that can distinguish between the plume of a countermeasure and the structured heat signature of an engine. The Block 2 upgrade also extends RAM's range modestly, from the original envelope of roughly 5 kilometers to somewhere in the 9 to 10 kilometer band depending on target geometry. That additional reach sounds modest against the SM-6's 100+ mile range, but in the terminal layer, every additional kilometer of engagement distance adds seconds of reaction time, and seconds are the unit of currency in that part of the fight. There is a problem embedded in this capability that rarely gets discussed in public assessments. The engagement geometry against supersonic low-altitude threats is genuinely difficult for any terminal defense system. A missile approaching at Mach 2 or above from a bearing that closes across the bow sector gives the defending ship a much narrower engagement window than the same threat approaching from directly ahead or directly astern. The Mk-49 launcher's traversal speed is finite. If the threat geometry forces simultaneous engagements on widely separated bearings, a single launcher may not be able to address all of them before the window closes. On destroyers, one RAM launcher is typically positioned forward and one aft, with overlapping coverage arcs. On carriers, additional launchers compensate. But the geometry problem remains, and the answer to it is not more RAM rounds. It is maintaining sufficient outer layer kill probability to ensure that the terminal layer never faces that geometry simultaneously on multiple bearings. The Phalanx CIWS sits just inside RAM in the defensive architecture, and the two systems are complementary in ways that reinforce this point. Phalanx uses its own fire control radar and fires a stream of tungsten penetrators at extremely close range, within 1 mile. It is the absolute last resort before physical impact. Its ammunition is cheap. Its reaction time is the fastest of any system on the ship. But it is also the system operating with the least margin for error, because a target that reaches Phalanx range is a target that has already penetrated everything else. Phalanx succeeds regularly in testing and in real engagements, but accepting Phalanx as the primary terminal defense rather than RAM means accepting that threats will routinely reach within a mile of the ship before being engaged. That is not a comfortable operational posture for a hull that costs $2 billion and carries a crew of nearly 300. Here is an unpopular read on the current situation. The pace of SM-6 consumption in the Red Sea through 2024 and into 2025 exposed a production and stockpile gap that the Pentagon had been aware of on paper for years but had not closed. Using multi-million-dollar interceptors as the primary response to $20,000 drones was never intended to be sustainable, and the operational record confirms it was not. The Navy's point defense architecture, RAM, Phalanx, layered depth, was designed around the assumption that the outer layer would thin saturation attacks, not absorb them entirely. When the outer layer is used as the primary defense against low-end threats, the inner layer's value becomes visible in the inventory reports. The strategic level of this problem runs deeper than any individual system's performance. The contest between a defensive interceptor and the weapon it is designed to stop is a version of the shield and sword competition that has characterized every period of military technology. In the naval context, The specific version of that competition playing out now is between the cost of defense and the cost of offense. An offense has a structural cost advantage at the low end. A Shahed 136 costs somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000. Producing them at scale, as Iran has demonstrated it can, supplying Houthi forces in Yemen with hundreds of units, requires industrial capacity that is substantially below the threshold needed to build an SM-6. The production economics favor the attacker. The United States can outproduce Iran in absolute terms, but the ratio of interceptor cost to drone cost means that even a modest drone production advantage translates into a significant defensive inventory problem over a sustained campaign. RAM does not solve this problem, but it addresses it more efficiently than the outer layer systems at the terminal ring. $1 million RAM round versus a $50,000 drone is a worse ratio than anyone wants. It is a better ratio than $4 million, and it is a vastly better ratio than allowing the threat to impact. The deeper point is that layered defense is the architectural answer to cost asymmetry precisely because it prevents the adversary from forcing all engagements to occur at the most expensive layer. If every inbound threat is handled by SM-6, the adversary's cost optimization works. They spend $20,000 to consume $4 million of American capacity. If some of those threats are pushed to RAM, the ratio changes. If some are pushed to Phalanx, the ratio changes further. The layers distribute the burden across systems with different cost profiles, and in doing so, they degrade the adversary's arithmetic. This is the piece that most assessments of naval point defense underweight. The conversation tends to focus on whether RAM can intercept a given threat, and the technical answer is generally yes, within its engagement envelope. The more important question is what RAM does to the adversary's cost model when it is present as a layer. The answer is that it removes the ability to force all engagements to the expensive layer. That is not a tactical advantage, it is a strategic one. The human reality of what this architecture is protecting is worth pausing on, not to dramatize it, but because the numbers abstract what is actually at stake. An Arleigh Burke class destroyer carries approximately 300 crew. A Nimitz-class carrier carries roughly 5,000 sailors and aviators when its air wing is embarked. The Gerald R. Ford, the Navy's newest carrier, operates with a reduced crew of around 4,500 due to automation improvements, but the principle is the same. Behind every layer of this defense system, behind every RAM round cycling through its launcher, and every SM-6 leaving its vertical launch cell, is the question of what happens if the layers fail. The USS Stark in 1987 was struck by 2 Exocet missiles. 37 sailors died. The ship was not sunk, but it was grievously damaged and out of action for months. The subsequent analysis of why the Stark's defenses did not engage. The Phalanx was in standby mode. The threat was not recognized until too late. Accelerated the deployment of systems, including RAM. Every gap identified in that analysis became a requirement that shaped the terminal defense architecture that exists today. The lesson was not only technical, it was procedural. A system that requires human authorization at every step is only as fast as the human in the loop. In the terminal seconds of an engagement, that is not fast enough. The autonomous engagement modes built into both Phalanx and RAM, the ability to detect, classify, and engage without waiting for a command, exist because the Stark demonstrated what happens when reaction time is constrained by human decision. Latency. The captain who oversees the system has already made the engagement decision in advance. By setting the system's mode before the threat appears, the tactical decision is made in the calm. The execution is delegated to the machine. That delegation is its own source of operational complexity. Autonomous engagement modes raise questions about identification, about engagement of ambiguous contacts, about the risk of engaging a friendly or civilian aircraft. Every Navy that operates autonomous terminal defense systems has had to work through rules of engagement that balance the speed required to function against the accuracy required to avoid catastrophic misidentification. The USS Vincennes shootdown of Iran Air Flight 655 in 1988, the same year RAM was entering service, is the defining cautionary case. A warship in a tense operational environment, operating under pressure, with ambiguous sensor data, made a decision that killed 290 civilians. The Aegis system performed as designed. The human interpretation of its data did not. RAM's autonomous modes operate within engagement geometries that are generally below the altitude and speed profile of commercial aviation, which reduces, though does not eliminate, the identification problem. But the underlying tension between reaction speed and decision accuracy is not solved by technology. It is managed by training, doctrine, and the rules of engagement set before the ship ever enters a contested area. One detail that stayed with us in looking at how RAM fits into the current operational picture. The Houthi targeting campaign in the Red Sea through 2024 and 2025 was, in a meaningful sense, a live test of the entire layered defense architecture under sustained operational conditions. Destroyers operating in the region engaged inbound threats across multiple layers, SM-2, SM-6, and at the terminal ring, RAM and Phalanx. No US Navy ship was sunk. Several experienced close engagements. The architecture functioned as designed. But the inventory question, the rate at which outer layer cells were consumed, the lead time on replacement rounds, the production capacity of US missile manufacturers, surfaced in congressional testimony and defense budget discussions in ways that confirmed what planners had known analytically. The system is sound. The production pipeline is not yet scaled to match the demand that a sustained high-intensity campaign would place on it. That gap is the current operational challenge, not the performance of RAM, not the performance of SM-6. The industrial throughput of American missile manufacturing, relative to consumption rate that adversaries can impose by deploying large numbers of cheap threats. Here is the take that will probably get some pushback. The answer to the cost asymmetry problem is not a more expensive interceptor. It is not a better RAM. It is not a next-generation point defense system that costs more per round and is harder to produce. The answer is accepting that the terminal layer needs to be cheap and high volume, and designing the production system accordingly. Directed energy, laser and high-power microwave systems, represents the most credible path to a terminal defense layer with a cost per engagement in the hundreds of dollars rather than the hundreds of thousands. The Navy has the Helios laser system in development and has deployed early variants to surface combatants. The challenge is the physics of operating high-power lasers in the maritime environment, salt spray, humidity, beam degradation, and the power generation requirements of a shipboard installation. Those problems are solvable. They are not yet solved. Until they are, RAM is the most cost-efficient terminal defense layer available, and the 40-year-old spinning missile continues to justify its place on the back deck of the most advanced warships in the world. Will laser systems make RAM obsolete within a decade? Comment yes or no below, because the production and power timelines on directed energy are genuinely uncertain, and the range of expert opinion is wider than the headlines suggest. The architecture described in this breakdown is not static. The threat is not static. The Shad family of drones has evolved through multiple variants. The Houthi arsenal includes radar-guided anti-ship missiles alongside the drone inventory. Iranian-origin supersonic anti-ship missiles in the inventories of adversary forces represent a terminal engagement challenge that is qualitatively different from a subsonic drone swarm, and the geometry of a high-speed, low-altitude threat arriving with seconds of warning is one the outer layers must handle before RAM's engagement window even opens. The layered defense is designed around exactly that reality. It is designed to fail gracefully, meaning that the failure of any single layer does not mean the loss of the ship because the next layer exists. RAM exists because the architects of the system never assumed that outer layers would be perfect. They assumed they would be good, and good enough most of the time, and that most of the time required the inner layer for the rest. So the question that frames this entire architecture, whether to spend the costly long-range rounds early, or hold them and trust the 1980s missile at the wall, does not have a general answer. It has a situational one. The captain who holds SM-6 inventory against a Shahed swarm to preserve capacity for a possible anti-ship missile follow-on wave is making a rational calculation. The captain who expends SM-6 against everything incoming and runs the outer layer dry before the second wave arrives has also made a calculation. Both decisions have costs that only become visible in hindsight. What the rolling airframe missile represents in that decision space is not a solution to the dilemma. It is the reason the dilemma does not become fatal. 21 rounds at the inner ring, cycling fast, independent of the vertical launch inventory, guiding passively on heat, are the margin between a managed engagement and an unmanaged one. A compact spinning missile designed in the 1970s, fielded in the 1990s, upgraded twice since then, still standing the watch at the innermost ring of the most capable naval defense system ever built. The paradox in the title is real, so is the answer. If you want to understand the full outer architecture that RAM works inside, what the SM-6 and Aegis are actually doing when they push a threat toward the inner ring, that breakdown is next.